Hello, welcome to the Horror Night. Please write from which country or city you're watching, and don't forget to subscribe. Now, enjoy the horror story. My name is Jonathan Harker, and I write these lines from the beginning of a journey that has already begun to feel like a descent into a strange and shadowy world. I left Munich at exactly 8:35 on the evening of May 1st, traveling by train toward what I believed would be a professional adventure, but what already feels like something far more unsettling. By the following morning, I had reached Vienna, although the train was an hour behind schedule. Still, the transition from the Germanic lands into the heart of the continent was seamless, at least on the surface. From there, I pressed onward to Budapest. I had little time to explore the city, but what I saw during my brief stroll near the station was captivating. Grand buildings, bustling markets, and the distant outline of hills beneath the pale sky. The Danube, flowing dark and broad beneath the bridge we crossed, seemed almost symbolic, a boundary between the known and the mysterious. As we moved eastward, that sensation only deepened. The people became more diverse, their features more unfamiliar, their tongues more foreign. When night fell and we pulled into Klausenberg, I felt the last tether to home loosen. I stayed at the Hotel Royal, where I was served paprika Händel, a spicy chicken dish that burned pleasantly and made me terribly thirsty. I noted it down for Mina, thinking she'd enjoy its flavor. They say it's a local specialty throughout the Carpathians. My German helped me communicate, though barely. Even here, I felt the language thinning like mist. Every step forward feels like stepping into a fog where shapes are strange, and shadows follow you closely. The next morning, after a modest breakfast and some strong black coffee, I boarded the train bound for Bistritz. As we rumbled through the Transylvanian countryside, I began to notice a shift in the atmosphere. The fields were wilder, untamed. The mountains loomed closer, thick with dark forests that seemed to whisper secrets to one another. Villages became fewer and farther between. The peasants I glimpsed wore garments unlike anything I'd seen in Western Europe. Brightly colored vests, sheepskin cloaks, and high boots. They appeared wary of strangers, yet deeply connected to their land. At every stop, I noticed the same pattern. Curious eyes peeking from behind curtains, silent nods exchanged among locals, and always, a strange sense of something unspoken hanging in the air. When I told one innkeeper I was on my way to visit Count Dracula at his castle, he grew visibly tense. He crossed himself quickly and turned his eyes away, muttering something in a language I didn't recognize. Another woman, overhearing our conversation, handed me a crucifix and whispered something that sounded like a prayer. I tried to smile, to laugh off their superstition, but I must confess, it left a mark. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the trees cast long, crooked shadows across the tracks, and a chill crept into the compartment. The air felt different, older. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was traveling not just through space, but through time itself. The land around me seemed ancient, untouched by modern hands. I began to wonder, what sort of man lives out here, hidden away from the world? As night approached, I arrived at the station in Bistritz, a quaint little town nestled deep in the Carpathian Mountains. The air was crisp and carried the faint scent of pine and wood smoke. A man from the hotel, holding a sign with my name, greeted me with a slight bow and took my bag. The inn, called the Golden Crone, was warm and bustling with locals. Wooden beams crisscrossed the ceiling, and a fire crackled in the large stone hearth. The people were lively, talking, drinking, playing some folk music that had a mournful but oddly inviting tone. I introduced myself to the innkeeper and handed him the letter from Count Dracula. He read it with great seriousness, then looked up at me, his eyes sharp with something like concern. "You are welcome," he said in halting English. "The Count, he expects you tomorrow. A carriage will come for you at the Borgo Pass." The name sounded mysterious, like a gateway to another realm. That evening, I dined alone, reviewing my travel notes and trying to settle my nerves. I couldn't help but notice how often the locals glanced my way. One older woman approached and, in broken English and Romanian, begged me not to go. She clutched my arm and asked, "Do you know what day it is? Do you know where you go?" When I answered calmly that I was going to visit Count Dracula, she grew pale and pressed a small object into my hand. It was a silver crucifix. "For your mother's sake," she whispered, then turned and left without another word. I felt a strange unease creeping into me. These people weren't simply afraid, they were terrified. And yet I couldn't turn back. The path was set. Tomorrow I would meet the Count himself. I hardly slept that night. The shadows in my room seemed to dance with every flicker of the candlelight, and the wind howled through the narrow streets like a restless spirit. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked furiously, then suddenly stopped, as if silenced. When morning came, it felt more like a reprieve than a beginning. I dressed, packed my things, and came down to breakfast where the innkeeper and several others were waiting, watching me intently. They offered me hearty food, dark bread, cheese, eggs, and strong coffee, but I could hardly eat. Just before departure, the older woman from last night appeared again and silently placed a rosary around my neck. I tried to refuse, but she insisted, tears forming in her eyes. "It will protect you," she said, almost inaudibly. Then the coachman came in, announcing that the journey to the Borgo Pass must begin. I stepped outside to find the carriage ready, drawn by strong horses that seemed restless and uneasy. The coachman, a broad-shouldered man in heavy furs, eyed me cautiously, then nodded for me to enter. The sky was overcast, and the wind had a bite to it. As we rolled out of Bistritz, the townspeople made gestures of farewell, but also of warning. Some crossed themselves, others muttered under their breath. The road wound upward, through forests thick with ancient trees. Occasionally, we passed shrines or crosses erected at crossroads, silent markers of forgotten fears. The driver urged the horses faster, glancing often toward the darkening horizon. I tried to focus on the beauty of the landscape, but a creeping dread grew with every turn of the wheels. I was no longer just a traveler. I was a guest summoned into the heart of something unknown. As we continued our journey toward the Borgo Pass, the coach rocked and jolted over the uneven path that cut through dense pine forests and steep, narrow valleys. The landscape was wild and awe-inspiring, yet it carried an ominous weight, as though the earth itself guarded secrets too dark to speak of. My driver remained silent, only occasionally snapping the reins or murmuring to the horses in a language I couldn't understand. The further we traveled, the more I noticed peculiar signs. Wolves howling in the distance, strange carved symbols on roadside stones, and once, a group of peasants hurrying away as we approached, their faces pale with fear. Around noon, we stopped at a lonely inn on the roadside for a brief rest. The innkeeper spoke hurriedly to the driver in low tones and kept glancing at me with a mix of pity and worry. I asked if anything was wrong, but he only shook his head and offered me a flask of plum brandy. "For warmth," he said. As we resumed the journey, the mountains rose higher, their snow-capped peaks now visible even in the gray daylight. Soon the path became narrower, and the trees closed in, creating long corridors of shadow. By late afternoon, we reached the Borgo Pass. The air here was thinner and colder, and a heavy mist had begun to settle, swirling low to the ground. The driver halted the coach abruptly, stepped down, and pointed up the road. "There," he said. "You wait." Before I could ask what he meant, he climbed back on and drove away, leaving me alone on the edge of the unknown. Moments later, through the mist, I saw a black carriage approaching, drawn by 4 coal-dark horses, with a driver whose face was hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat and cloak. My journey into Count Dracula's world was about to truly begin. The black carriage came to a stop just inches from where I stood, and before I could utter a word, the driver leapt down with uncanny speed and agility. He was tall and gaunt, cloaked entirely in black, and though the brim of his hat concealed most of his features, I could make out the pallor of his skin and the glint of something ancient in his eyes. Without speaking, he gestured toward the carriage door, which creaked open on its own as if moved by an unseen force. The interior was dark but richly upholstered, and I climbed in hesitantly, my curiosity outweighing my caution. As soon as I was seated, the driver mounted again, and with a sharp crack of the whip, the horses lunged forward. We began ascending a narrow mountain path, flanked on both sides by sheer drops and towering cliffs. The mist had thickened to the point where I could barely see past the windows, and I had the strange feeling that we were no longer following a natural road. Shadows danced in the corners of my vision, and once or twice I thought I glimpsed figures running alongside the carriage, swift, silent, and vanishing whenever I turned to look directly. The forest seemed alive, watching, whispering, and I became keenly aware of my isolation. I had never before felt so fully removed from the world I knew. The horses showed no signs of tiring, and the driver made no sound. Time felt distorted, as though I were being carried not just through space, but into some other realm altogether. I gripped the edge of the seat and peered ahead, trying to spot the outline of Castle Dracula, but only the swirling fog and darkened trees greeted me. This was no ordinary journey, and the night had only just begun. As we climbed higher, the night deepened, and the moon, though full, was often hidden behind thick, fast-moving clouds. The road, if it could still be called that, narrowed dangerously, winding like a serpent through the Carpathian peaks. Trees bent over the path, their limbs twisted like arthritic fingers, and strange noises echoed through the forest. Howls, rustlings, and something like whispered words that didn't belong to any language I knew. I dared not open the window, though the air inside the carriage grew increasingly stale and heavy. Then, without warning, the carriage came to a sudden halt. I peered out, but the driver was gone, vanished as if plucked from the seat. Before I could react, I heard a wild chorus of howls rise from the trees, a dreadful sound that chilled my blood. Wolves! I froze, heart pounding, listening to the snarls and yelps grow louder. Then, incredibly, I saw them. A great pack of wolves surrounding the carriage, eyes glowing like embers in the dark. But they did not attack. Instead, they stood perfectly still, as if held in place by some invisible command. And then, from the mist, the driver reappeared, no sign of fear or urgency in his manner. He walked among the wolves like a master among hounds, and with a single gesture, they scattered back into the woods. No words were spoken. He resumed his seat, cracked the whip once more, and off we went. I sat in stunned silence, shaken to my core. This was no ordinary servant. This was no ordinary place. I began to wonder if the tales I had dismissed so readily, of the undead, of cursed lands, held more truth than I'd imagined. We pressed on into the heart of the mountains, the darkness now absolute save for the carriage lanterns and the moon's pale light breaking intermittently through the shrouded sky. The air grew colder, each breath a plume of mist, and the silence between the wind gusts felt impossibly deep, like the earth itself was holding its breath. Then, just as I was beginning to drift into a dazed, uneasy state, the driver pulled the carriage to a sudden and complete stop. We had arrived. The horses neighed nervously, and the coach creaked as it settled. I leaned out the window and saw before me a vast ruined battlement, towering above like a relic of some long-dead empire. Castle Dracula. Its black stones seemed to drink in the moonlight, casting no reflections, and a chill wind swirled around its turrets as if the castle itself breathed. As I stepped down from the carriage, the driver handed me my luggage with inhuman ease, his strength startling in such a lean figure. Then, without a word, he vanished once more into the night, leaving me utterly alone before the looming gates. I stood there, unsure of what to do, when suddenly the heavy door creaked open, not with a servant or a guard, but as if beckoned by unseen hands. From within came the flickering of candlelight, casting long, dancing shadows on the damp stone walls. A voice echoed faintly, deep and calm. "Enter freely and of your own will." I hesitated, but something compelled me forward. I stepped into the threshold, leaving behind the familiar world, and with it, perhaps, my safety and reason. The door swung shut behind me with a thud that echoed like a coffin lid being sealed. I was inside Castle Dracula. The entrance hall was massive, its vaulted ceiling lost in shadow. The walls were of ancient stone, cold and damp to the touch, yet everything was impeccably clean. The dim candlelight flickered against iron sconces and heavy wooden beams, casting eerie shapes that seemed almost alive. Before I had time to fully absorb my surroundings, a tall figure emerged from a side corridor, his footsteps utterly silent. It was Count Dracula. His appearance was striking. Tall, thin, and dressed in black from head to toe, with a face as pale as parchment and eyes that gleamed with an unnatural intensity. His lips were thin and red, and his hands, peculiarly white and fine, seemed more like those of a corpse than a living man. Yet he moved with grace, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, even courteous. "Welcome to my house, Mr. Harker. Come freely. Go safely, and leave something of the happiness you bring." His words, though polite, carried an odd weight, almost as if they were spoken out of ritual, not warmth. I thanked him and followed as he gestured toward a staircase, noting as I did that there were no mirrors anywhere in sight. He led me through a maze of narrow corridors until we reached a room prepared for me. A fine chamber with heavy drapes, old furniture, and a large writing desk. Yet, despite its grandeur, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stepped not into a home, but into a carefully constructed prison. As the Count left me to settle in, I took a moment to inspect my room more closely. It was comfortable, even luxurious, yet it had an air of abandonment, as though no one had stayed here for years. The thick curtains, when drawn back, revealed a window that opened to a sheer drop into darkness. There was no visible path or courtyard below, only the endless wall of the cliff. I began to unpack, but curiosity soon drew me to the door. Stepping out into the corridor, I found that many of the passages twisted and turned aimlessly, leading to locked doors or blank stone walls. It was as if the castle itself had been designed to confuse and entrap. At dinner, Count Dracula joined me. We sat in a grand, high-ceilinged dining hall, lit by a massive chandelier that looked like it had hung there since medieval times. Strangely, I noticed that only I was served food. The Count, though present, did not eat or drink. He simply watched me with polite interest, asking questions about England, its cities, customs, and people. He seemed especially intrigued by our legal systems and real estate laws, asking in great detail about property rights and conveyances. When I offered him a mirror I had brought to show him a sketch I made, I noticed with a shudder that he cast no reflection. I blinked and looked again. Nothing. He must have seen my expression, for a strange smile played upon his lips. "A trifle superstition," he said smoothly, and quickly turned the conversation elsewhere, but a chill had already sunk into my bones. The coach rattled down steep hills, twisting through dark woods and open fields alike. Every now and then, we'd pass a lonely shepherd guiding his flock under the silver glow of the moon, the sheep like soft-moving clouds against the earth. The deeper we went into the Carpathians, the more surreal the journey became. The horses snorted nervously, their breath steaming in the cold air, and even the driver seemed increasingly tense. The road was growing narrower, winding dangerously along cliffs where one wrong turn could send us all plunging into the dark. The silence between us passengers had grown thick and uneasy. A heavy fog crept in, swirling around the wheels and licking the windows like ghostly fingers. I could feel the temperature drop, the chill biting through my coat. The stillness was only broken by the sudden howls of wolves in the distance, sharp and echoing through the mountain air. I saw the driver cross himself again. Beside me, a woman clutched a small cross at her neck and whispered something I couldn't understand, but the fear in her eyes said enough. Something about this part of the world felt untouched by time, wild, sacred, and dangerous. Though I couldn't explain it, a sense of dread began to creep into my thoughts. I reminded myself that I was here for business, to meet Count Dracula as arranged. But still, I began to question. What sort of man chooses to live at the edge of the world, hidden in mist and legend? As we continued the journey, the shadows grew longer and the air felt heavier, as if the night itself was pressing down upon us. I glanced out the window and saw the mountains looming higher, their peaks lost in clouds. The trees became denser, their gnarled branches arching over the road like skeletal arms, blotting out the moonlight. Our coach lanterns flickered uneasily, casting distorted shapes that danced along the trees and rocks. Then, suddenly, without warning, the driver pulled the reins sharply and brought the coach to a halt. The horses reared up in protest, clearly disturbed. I leaned forward, trying to see what had caused the stop, but all I could make out was darkness stretching ahead. The driver jumped down and scanned the road ahead cautiously, then without a word, returned and drove on with even more urgency. My heart began to race, not out of fear exactly, but a growing sense of being watched. I felt eyes on us from the forest, as if hidden creatures were tracking our every movement. The sound of wolves howling returned, this time closer. Their cries sent shivers down my spine, primal and haunting. A woman in the back began to quietly weep. No one tried to comfort her. We were each absorbed in our own unease. I tried to focus on my reason for being here, reminding myself that I was not a child frightened by fairy tales. And yet, the dread that hung in the air could not be denied. The Carpathians were alive with secrets, and we were trespassing in their domain. The coach pressed on, climbing steadily into the highlands. The road narrowed and twisted, clinging to the edge of cliffs that dropped into shadowy ravines below. I gripped the window frame as the wheels bumped over jagged stones, each jolt reminding me how far we were from any sign of civilization. The other passengers had grown silent, their faces pale and tense. Even the driver, who had earlier cracked jokes and sung under his breath, now sat rigid, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow. I caught him murmuring something in a low voice, prayers, perhaps, or charms against evil. We passed a small shrine by the roadside, and he quickly crossed himself. Then, he reached into his coat and handed me a crucifix without saying a word. I hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to laugh or thank him, but something in his eyes told me not to refuse. I took it, and he seemed slightly relieved, as though he'd just completed a duty. The crucifix felt oddly comforting in my hand, though I still considered myself a rational man who put little stock in superstition. Still, I tucked it into my coat pocket. Moments later, a thick mist began to rise from the valleys, creeping onto the road and swirling around the horse's legs. It moved unnaturally, not like ordinary fog, but as if it had a purpose of its own, wrapping us in silence and isolation. The lamps could barely pierce it, and everything beyond a few feet vanished into white. The horses slowed, uneasy once more. We were now completely in the grasp of this strange land, its darkness, its legends, its waiting silence. As we moved deeper into the misty wilderness, time felt as if it had slipped into another rhythm altogether, slower, more haunting. The wind howled through the mountain passes like distant cries, and the trees stood tall and menacing, their gnarled branches clawing at the air. The coachman cracked his whip sharply, urging the horses forward, but they resisted, trembling with each step. Then, without warning, the driver brought the coach to a sudden stop. I leaned out of the window, but could see nothing through the thick fog. The driver jumped down and approached a large boulder beside the road. He knelt there briefly, whispering something I couldn't hear, then returned with a face more pale than before. When he climbed back onto his seat, his hands shook as he took up the reins. The locals had already told me strange tales back in the village, of wolves that hunted like men, of figures who never cast shadows, of a castle that rose only for the cursed to see. At the time, I'd smiled politely and dismissed it all as folklore. But now, as we crept through this ghostly veil, I began to feel those stories pressing at the back of my mind. Every rustle of leaves, every sudden gust, seemed to carry more than just sound, carried warning. Just then, a far-off howl broke the silence. It was not the call of an ordinary wolf. It was long, echoing, and unervingly human in its sorrow. I glanced at the other passengers, but their heads were bowed, eyes shut tight in prayer. And I sat frozen, gripping the crucifix in my pocket like a lifeline I never thought I'd need. The road narrowed as we climbed higher, twisting like a serpent through the jagged cliffs. The mist thickened around us, curling in tendrils against the windows, as though trying to find its way inside. At intervals, the horses would rear or snort in panic, their hooves skidding on the gravel, and the coachman would curse in some tongue I didn't recognize, his voice strained with fear rather than anger. Then I saw them. Faint, ghostly blue flames flickering beside the road. They appeared one at a time, small and low to the ground, vanishing as suddenly as they came. The coachman stopped the carriage again. Without saying a word, he descended and walked toward the flicker of light, holding a small spade. I watched him dig for a few moments, his form barely visible in the haze. When he returned, he was carrying something wrapped tightly in cloth and quickly stashed it beneath the driver's seat. Never meeting my eyes, I dared not ask. My imagination was beginning to spin wild theories. Perhaps these flames marked buried treasure, or something more sinister, something unholy. I had read of will-o'-the-wisps in superstitions, lights that led travelers to their doom. My heart thudded loudly in my chest as the wheels rolled on. The eerie silence returned, broken only by the creak of the carriage and the occasional distant howl. I realized then that night had fully fallen. We were no longer part of the world I knew. We were in a realm of shadow, and every passing second seemed to carry us deeper into its heart. As we ventured deeper into the wilderness, the moon rose high above the treetops, casting a ghostly silver light that danced across the rugged terrain. The coach pressed on through forests so thick that even moonlight struggled to penetrate. Shadows moved across the path, not of animals but something more elusive, more watchful. I began to sense eyes upon us, hidden in the dense underbrush or behind ancient trees, as if unseen beings were keeping pace with the carriage. Every so often, the wolves would howl in unison, and it sent a chill rippling through me. Their cries were not just animalistic. They sounded like warnings, long and mournful, echoing from the surrounding cliffs like voices of the dead. The coachman remained oddly calm. Each time we passed one of those blue flames, he would stop and repeat his strange ritual, digging silently, collecting some hidden item, and storing it without explanation. I felt trapped between worlds. One foot still in the logical, daylight world of London, and the other now pulled into a realm where superstition, danger, and the unnatural ruled. I looked out again, and through a clearing in the trees, saw a ruin, an ancient, crumbling stone tower silhouetted against the night sky. It looked abandoned for centuries, yet a dim glow pulsed from one of its broken windows. I turned to ask the coachman about it, but he only urged the horses faster, his eyes refusing to meet mine. The speed of the carriage increased as if we were running from something we couldn't see, or worse, something that had already seen us. The landscape grew even more mysterious as we climbed higher into the Carpathian Mountains. The road became a narrow, twisting path, clinging to the edge of steep cliffs with dizzying drops on either side. Cold winds howled through the trees, and the horses struggled to keep their footing on the slippery, uneven stones. Just when I thought the path couldn't get more treacherous, a sudden burst of wind blew through the forest, extinguishing one of the coach's lanterns. We were plunged into semi-darkness, relying only on the pale light of the moon and the driver's uncanny familiarity with the terrain. I tried to shake off the rising fear, but every instinct warned me that we were nearing something ominous. The howls of the wolves grew closer now, not distant echoes but sharp, immediate cries that pierced the silence. The horses began to whine nervously, their hooves stamping the ground as if sensing an unseen threat. The coachman, however, remained as steady as ever, whispering strange words under his breath in what I assumed was some ancient dialect. His calm in the face of such fear was almost unnatural. As the carriage turned a bend, I saw ahead a massive gate, black, iron-wrought and ancient, standing open as if expecting us. Beyond it, a long, shadowed path led to a vast, dark silhouette that loomed like a sleeping beast under the moonlight. My heart pounded. We had arrived. Castle Dracula stood before me, its towering spires piercing the night sky like claws reaching for the heavens. I had never felt so far from home or from safety. The horses came to a sudden halt in front of the towering iron gate, as if even they dared not go any farther. Before the coachman could move, a strange figure emerged from the shadows, tall and thin, dressed completely in black. He carried a lantern, its dim flame casting eerie, flickering patterns on his sharp features. Without a word, he approached the coach, his movements smooth and soundless. His presence alone sent a chill crawling down my spine, not from the cold, but from something unexplainable, an unnatural stillness, like the air itself held its breath. The coachman jumped down, exchanged a few hurried words with the man in a language I couldn't understand, then quickly handed over my luggage. The tall figure turned to me and, in perfect English, said, "You are welcome to my house." His voice was low and polite, yet it seemed to echo, as if the mountains themselves were listening. I descended from the carriage, and as my feet touched the rocky path, I looked up at the immense structure looming ahead. The castle was even more intimidating up close. Its stone walls weathered and ancient, its turrets jagged like broken teeth. A heavy door creaked open on its own, revealing only blackness within. The man took my bags with surprising strength and gestured for me to enter. Though everything in me hesitated, I followed him into the darkness. The moment I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me with a final, echoing thud. There was no turning back now. I had crossed the threshold into Count Dracula's domain. The silence inside the castle was suffocating. The heavy door had shut with such finality. It felt like the world I knew had been locked out forever. I stood there for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light from the flickering torches mounted along the stone walls. The tall man, my host, no doubt, moved with silent confidence, his footsteps making no sound on the ancient stone floor. He led me through a long corridor lined with rich, though faded, tapestries. The air was thick with the scent of dust and age, and the coldness of the place wrapped itself around me like a shroud. I noticed there were no mirrors, no portraits, just the looming presence of history pressing down from every direction. Finally, we entered a vast, high-ceilinged room. A grand staircase curved up one side, and in the center, a large table was set for one. "You must be weary after your journey," he said softly, gesturing toward the chair. I took my seat, still trying to calm the unease that crept deeper into me with each passing moment. He did not join me but stood at the side, observing, studying. I realized then what had been gnawing at my nerves. Though he had greeted me, carried my bags, and now offered food, he had not smiled. Not once. And despite the flickering light, no shadow ever seemed to fully fall across his face. There was something not quite right about Count Dracula, though I couldn't yet put it into words. I began to eat, though my appetite was diminished by the tension that quietly pulsed through the room. The Count stood nearby, speaking politely, asking questions about my journey, England, and the details of my profession. His tone was calm and cultured, yet there was an undercurrent of intensity, like a man restraining something far more primal beneath a polished exterior. He seemed particularly fascinated by London, questioning me with an eagerness that bordered on obsessive. "And the streets," he asked, "are they always so full of life? So teeming with people?" There was a hunger in his curiosity, not of knowledge but of experience, almost as though he were trying to taste the city through my words. All the while, I noticed something odd. He never ate a bite. Not once. The dishes remained untouched in front of him, despite being lavishly prepared. His eyes, however, rarely left me. They followed every movement of my hand, every gesture, every mouthful I took. And when I glanced up at him, I met a gaze so fixed, so still, it sent a chill through my spine. It was not the stare of a gracious host. It was something else, something watchful, calculating, ancient. I tried to push away the growing discomfort, reminding myself of my business here. But even as I smiled and answered his questions, a quiet warning echoed in my mind. I was in a place unlike any I had known, under the roof of a man unlike any I had ever met. As the evening deepened, the fire in the hearth crackled gently, casting flickering shadows on the old stone walls. The Count invited me to sit with him by the fire, and I obliged, though something in me longed for rest. He seemed tireless, full of questions, his interest in England extending beyond mere curiosity. He asked about our law system, our customs, and particularly about property rights and ownership. His questions were oddly specific, as though he were preparing for something much larger than a simple relocation. I answered him as best I could, aware that I was not only his guest, but his legal advisor as well. Yet, the longer the conversation went on, the more I felt like a subject under examination. The Count never once leaned back or slouched. He remained upright, perfectly still, except for the occasional graceful gesture of his hand. And the silence between his words was thick, like a space pregnant with unspoken thoughts. When at last I expressed my fatigue from the long journey, he smiled politely and offered to show me to my room. As I rose, I became aware again of the vastness of the castle, the silence that pressed in from every corridor, and the cold that no fire could entirely drive away. Following him, I felt as though I were moving deeper into something unknown. Not just a home, but a labyrinth of secrets. The walls, the air, the very stones seemed to whisper warnings I couldn't yet decipher. I found that my landlord had gone on ahead to secure a seat in the diligence, and the landlady was kindly assisting me with my belongings. The carriage was quite roomy, and I settled in, still writing as the horses were being changed. As I sat there, a strange uneasiness began to creep over me. It wasn't from fear exactly, but rather a peculiar sense that I was being watched. The locals, clustered around the inn, were casting glances my way, furtive, curious, even pitying. One older woman, in particular, approached me timidly. She held out a crucifix, muttering something in a language I could not understand. She pressed it into my hand with an urgency that surprised me. I attempted to decline, but her insistence left me little choice. As the coachman signaled for departure, she crossed herself repeatedly and whispered what I could only assume were prayers. I tucked the crucifix into my coat pocket, not out of belief, but out of politeness. Yet even as the coach pulled away, the memory of her concerned eyes lingered in my mind. The horses seemed anxious too, snorting and stamping as if they could sense something unseen. As the carriage rolled through the narrowing mountain road, shadows lengthened and the forests on either side grew thicker and darker. The sky turned from gray to a deepening twilight. I tried to focus on my journal, but that same gnawing feeling returned. Something unknown was waiting beyond these woods. I felt the crucifix in my pocket and, to my own surprise, was grateful for it. As the carriage continued its climb up the steep Carpathian slopes, the landscape became increasingly wild and rugged. Trees now towered like sentinels on either side of the winding road, their thick branches intertwining above us, forming a dark canopy that shut out the remaining daylight. The driver cracked his whip occasionally, not just to urge the horses forward, but as if trying to shoo away an invisible menace. The silence was broken only by the rumble of the wheels on the rocky path and the occasional howl of wolves from the distant forest. Each sound felt amplified in the stillness of the mountains. I glanced at the other passengers, peasants wrapped in heavy cloaks, who sat rigid, their eyes wide with unease. Every so often, one would whisper something and cross themselves. Their behavior made it clear they were deeply fearful, though of what, I could not tell. My thoughts kept circling back to the old woman and her gift of the crucifix. I pulled it from my pocket and examined it under the dim light. Though I was not a superstitious man, I found an odd comfort in the feel of it between my fingers. I could not help but wonder what danger she believed I might encounter. The wind picked up, whistling through the trees with a mournful sound, and the coach rocked slightly as it rounded another sharp bend. Every turn seemed to draw us deeper into a land forgotten by time, a place where nature ruled and something ancient, perhaps malevolent, lay watching in silence. I shivered, though I wasn't cold. Just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the entire landscape in deepening shades of violet and blue, we reached a narrow pass between two massive cliffs. The driver suddenly pulled the horses to a halt. A hush fell over everyone. I leaned forward, peering out into the gloom. In the distance, a solitary figure stood at the edge of the pass, holding a lantern that glowed faintly in the encroaching darkness. The driver exchanged a few rapid words in a low voice with the stranger, then turned and gestured for me to get down. My heart thudded with a mix of anticipation and unease. As I descended from the coach, the other passengers averted their eyes, some crossing themselves again. The driver handed my luggage to the tall, dark figure, who nodded silently. He was clad in black from head to toe, his face pale and expressionless beneath the lantern's flickering light. His presence, though composed, radiated an unsettling intensity, as though he belonged more to the night than to the world of men. Without a word, he led me to a small, strange-looking carriage, black as coal and drawn by powerful horses that pawed nervously at the ground. I turned to bid farewell to the coach passengers, but the driver cracked his whip sharply, and the vehicle vanished down the trail like a shadow in retreat. I stood in the eerie silence, the mountain winds whispering through the rocks, and realized I had crossed an invisible threshold, from the known into the unknown. The stranger opened the door and motioned for me to enter. I hesitated just a moment, then stepped inside. The inside of the carriage was cold and unusually dark, despite the moonlight that streamed faintly through the narrow windows. As I settled into the seat, the door shut behind me with a metallic finality, and the mysterious driver took his place without making a sound. The horses started forward with a sudden jolt, and we were off, swiftly, silently, moving like a shadow through the blackness of the Carpathians. Outside, the towering cliffs loomed like giants, their jagged peaks slicing into the night sky. The only sound was the rhythmic beat of hooves on the stony path and the occasional gust of wind that howled through the ravines like a distant wail. I tried to speak to the driver to ask where we were heading, but he did not respond. His back was straight, eyes fixed ahead, his expression unreadable in the half-light. A strange unease gripped me. Not fear exactly, but a powerful sense that I was in the presence of something unnatural. From time to time, I thought I saw faint flickers in the shadows outside. Perhaps wolves watching from the rocks, their eyes glinting in the dark. Once or twice, the horses snorted and shied at some unseen presence. But the driver spoke softly in a language I couldn't understand, and they settled. It was clear he held some mastery over both beast and terrain. The further we rode, the more I felt time losing its grip. Minutes seemed like hours. I glanced at my watch, but it had stopped. The silence inside the coach was absolute, save for my own breath and the dull pounding of my heart. Suddenly, the coach halted. I looked out, expecting to see some village or perhaps a mountain inn, but we were surrounded only by forest, thick, dark, and oppressive. The trees stood like sentinels, their twisted branches clawing at the air. Before I could ask why we had stopped, the driver leapt down with surprising agility and opened the door. He pointed silently to the path ahead, as though indicating I should disembark. I hesitated. There was no house in sight, no road visible through the dense trees, just a narrow trail winding into the darkness. As I stood at the edge of the carriage, unsure, I heard it, a rustle among the leaves, followed by the faintest whisper of movement. The air had grown colder, sharper, and a strange stillness pressed down upon everything. The driver stepped aside, allowing someone else to emerge from the forest shadows. A tall figure, cloaked in black, his face pale against the darkness, eyes gleaming with an intensity that struck me at once. He moved gracefully, with the precision of one who commanded every moment. His voice, when he spoke, was calm and courteous, though it echoed with a strange depth. "Welcome to my home, Mr. Harker. You are expected." The tone was hospitable, but carried with it an undercurrent that sent a chill down my spine. As I stepped onto the ground, he took my bags effortlessly in one hand and gestured for me to follow. I glanced once more at the driver. He was already turning the horses, ready to disappear into the night. And so, I followed the Count, deeper into the woods, towards the unknown. As we moved deeper into the forest, I began to lose all sense of time and direction. The narrow path wound through towering trees that seemed to lean inward, forming a tunnel of dark limbs and leaves overhead. The Count led the way with a lantern in hand, though the light it cast did little to pierce the gloom around us. His tall figure glided noiselessly over the uneven ground, as if the roots and stones simply shifted out of his path. I, on the other hand, stumbled frequently, my senses overwhelmed by the strangeness of this nocturnal world. Every few steps I thought I heard things: scratching, soft howls, and the occasional flicker of eyes in the distance. but whenever I turned, there was nothing there. The Count would pause now and then to ensure I was keeping pace, his smile courteous yet oddly unreadable. Eventually, the forest thinned slightly, and before us rose a vast silhouette, an ancient castle with crumbling towers and stone walls that seemed to blend into the night itself. A wave of unease washed over me. This was to be my residence? There were no lights in the windows, no signs of activity, only the looming architecture of another time. As we approached, the great door opened with a slow creak, revealing a long hall lit by flickering torches. The Count extended his hand, palm up, and spoke with that same unnerving politeness. "Enter freely and of your own will." I stepped inside, crossing the threshold into a world that felt colder, older, and far more secretive than anything I had ever known. The door shut behind me with a hollow thud that echoed like a warning. The Count took my coat and hung it with a care that seemed almost ceremonial, then led me down a stone corridor that twisted through the bowels of the ancient structure. The walls were adorned with faded tapestries and iron sconces that held flickering candles, casting dancing shadows on the worn floor. At last, we arrived at a large chamber. "This shall be your room," he said, pushing open a heavy wooden door. Inside, the room was surprisingly comfortable, with a roaring fire, carved furniture, and a table already set with a simple yet hearty meal. The warmth was welcome, but I could not shake the feeling that I had entered a place long cut off from the world. As I turned to thank the Count, I saw him standing still in the doorway, watching me with an intensity that bordered on unsettling. "You will find all you need," he said in that same low, careful tone. "If you should require anything, do not hesitate to ring the bell. But I must warn you, Mr. Harker, the castle is old and many of its rooms are unsafe. It is best you do not wander." With that cryptic caution, he gave a polite bow and vanished into the corridor. I stood alone in the chamber, surrounded by silence and the scent of age. My mind was racing with questions, but exhaustion quickly overtook me. I locked the door, more from instinct than necessity, and collapsed onto the bed. As I drifted into sleep, a single thought kept returning. I had entered the castle freely, but could I ever leave of my own will?